reading is called First They Came by Pastor Martin Niemöller. As an aside, with the political climate being what it is today, we may all be faced with precisely this type of a choice sometime within our immediate lifetimes. I hope we're ready for it. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists. I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. Again, I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. And I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak out for me.
Occasionally, you get a call that can change the direction of your life. You may not know it when you receive the call, and often the impact is not evident until many years later. Yet it can be a life-altering experience. I had such an experience 15 or 16 years ago. And one evening I was sitting at home minding my own business, and I got a call from somebody on the nominations committee at First Unitarian Society. Now, I've become more involved in the church, but not yet in a senior leadership position. The caller told me that the congregational president had just announced her resignation. The vice president was about to assume the duties of president, and would I take over as vice president? Now, while not assured, it was quite possible that I would eventually become president. Now, being a congregational president is not that big a deal. I'd run for president of the State Bar Association and lost. Nonetheless, for a congregation the size of this one or First Unitarian Society, whoever's in that role, this is a major undertaking. But being congenitally unable to say no, I accepted the invitation. Now, my service, first as vice president, later as president, gave me a unique insight to the operations of a large Unitarian church. And more importantly, for my later life, the opportunity to observe what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist minister. Though I would not actually pursue an encore career in ministry until after my service on the board, my experience as board president was a major factor in my decision to pursue ordained ministry, which of course finally came to fruition last April. Now, for the Reverend Waitzel Sharp and his wife Martha Sharp, that phone call was even more momentous on an even grander scale. In 1938, as noted in the prior reading, Waitzel was the minister of the Wellesley Unitarian Church in Massachusetts. His wife was a Hull House trained social worker. They were the parents of 2 young children. The American Unitarian Association, which had historic ties with Czechoslovakian Unitarians, was faced with the challenge of responding to the 1938 Munich Agreement, where in the Western countries, Western democracies, agreed that it would not oppose Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, allegedly to protect Germans living in that region, in exchange for what was referred to as peace in our time. According to the Holocaust Encyclopedia put out by the Holocaust Center in Washington, D.C., Robert Dexter, director of the American Unitarian Association's Department of Social Relations, recalled, "I knew that there would be untold suffering in the Nazi-occupied territories, and I was equally convinced that something should be done about it by those of us who felt we had an obligation to aid our friends who had been so betrayed. And so the AUA decided to mount a relief operation in Europe, focusing on what the Holocaust Encyclopedia refers to as the needs of unregistered refugees, especially Jews and anti-Nazi Germans from the Sudetenland, Austria, and Germany. And Dexter asked the Sharps to undertake this project. Leaving their 2 young children with close friends, Waitzel and Martha embarked on a project that would occupy the next 6 years of their lives. Among other things, this project resulted in the creation of the Unitarian Service Committee, which we now know as the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which continues with social justice projects to this day. Now, the Sharps' work facilitated the escape of Jews and other at-risk persons, especially children, from Europe as the war and German persecution continued. Often they were impeded by the actions of the U.S. government, which placed significant restrictions on the admission of refugees into the United States. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. From offices in Marseille, Lisbon, and other locations, again according to the encyclopedia, the Unitarians focused on political refugees, people who had been outspoken against Nazism in Germany or fascism in Spain, and whom other organizations were reluctant to help, as well as academics, scientists, and intellectuals. After the war, the Sharps returned to the United States and tried to resume their lives. Now, this work was not without its costs. They found themselves somewhat estranged from their children, who they had left behind, and their marriage ultimately ended in divorce. But in 1963, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial at Yad Vashem declared Martha Sharp and Waitzel Sharp as righteous among the nations, a category reserved for non-Jews who dedicated their lives to protecting the Jewish people. Martha was the first woman to receive that honor, and Martha and Waitzel were among the first 3 Americans to be so honored. Now, this coming Wednesday, September 20th at 8 p.m., PBS will air a Ken Burns documentary called Defying the Nazis, The Sharp Story. Later on this fall, we're going to be hosting a film and discussion here at Open Circle. If our technology works, we're going to show you a brief trailer for that documentary.
February 23rd, 1946. My darling Martha, I hope and assume this reaches you on your return from what must have been a very exacting but very successful expedition. I must say that I would like to begin having a home again. The kids don't show their feelings too much. I see nothing but men's things in my wardrobe. I smell no perfumes. I have been quite desperate at times. I want to go on for what there is left of life with you. 7 years ago tonight,
Sorry,
Perhaps not.
Would it help
it
to
just
fill
cut
the,
out. It stopped playing.
Fill the updates available box.
Just scoot off to the side.
Oh, that's for the start.
Okay.
No, sorry.
That's the home button.
That's not going to do it.
Well, it truly was a teaser.
Good idea.
I invite you, if you have time this Wednesday night,
It's
to watch
Tuesday.
Tuesday at the 20th. 20th. Tuesday night, the 20th. Sorry. I invite you to watch the documentary. I have ordered the documentary DVD itself and a book that accompanies it from Beacon Press, so you may wish to take a look at that. But that's a bit of history. So what is the relevance of the Sharps story for us today? I would suggest, as some others have alluded to this morning, that it has a great relevance in our current situation. First of all, it exemplifies the Margaret Mead quotation that we read at the opening of the service. She wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." When Martha and Waitzel began their task, it was just the two of them, plus Robert Dexter and his wife Elizabeth, and another Unitarian minister, Robert Joy. They had little knowledge of the Nazi persecution machine that they confronted. The full scale of the Nazi horrors was not to be disclosed for many years. They were faced with indifference and often outright hostility from the European governments that either ignored the plight of the refugees or actually collaborated with the Nazis in their persecution. And they faced the indifference, perhaps even the hostility, from their own American government to the emerging plight of the Jews in Europe. Again, as the Holocaust Museum describes it, in the first 7 years after Hitler came to power in 1933, an estimated 260,000 refugees from Germany emigrated to North and South America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Among them were 90,000 Jews who were admitted to the United States. But between 1940 and the end of World War II, when the need was the greatest, only 35,000 Jewish refugees were allowed into the United States. This was due in partly to U.S. restrictions on immigration, partly due to the German ban on Jewish emigration, and partly to the unavailability of ship transport and other wartime impediments. Thus, the Sharps and Dexters and Joy struggled to overcome the reluctance of the United States and other governments to admit refugees from the Nazi terror. Now, in the face of these obstacles, it would not have been unreasonable for the Sharps to say that the job just could not be done, especially by a group of 5 people. Yet for almost 6 years they persevered, sometimes saving 1 or 2, sometimes larger groups, sometimes ordinary individuals like 14-year-old Eva Rosemary Feigl, who was smuggled from Marseille, and sometimes prominent dissidents like the German Jewish novelist Leon Feuchtwanger, whose escape was made possible by a personal act of courage by Martha Sharp, who gave up her own ticket from Marseille to New York so Feuchtwanger and his wife could escape. I'm sure that Martha and Waitzel had their doubts. They must have thought long and hard before they left 2 young children behind when they embarked on what might very well have been a fool's errand. And in fact, one might even reasonably question their decision. Yet because of their singular decision, countless persons who might have otherwise been caught up in the Nazi machinery of death were spared. Now, as we think about the Sharp story, we may think of it as a singular act of courage at a time in our history calling for such acts. We may be tempted to think that our current time does not offer similar opportunities. Yet I suggest that that would be wrong. One of the defining issues of our time is immigration and our response to the refugee crisis created by the Syrian civil war and the plight of peoples living in various parts of Africa. Paper out of order here. While clearly the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees places incredible strains on immigration and refugee resettlement throughout the Western world, one cannot help but wonder how much this crisis is exacerbated by the fact that so many of the refugees are Muslims, and how much Islamophobia makes a difficult situation even worse. Just as anti-Semitism played a significant role in the failure of the United States government to strongly address the Jewish refugee crisis during World War II. And to what extent are concerns about so-called illegal immigrants fueled by the fact that the immigrants are people of color whose primary language is not English? If there were an influx of Canadians or Northern Europeans, would the response be as strong and negative? In promoting Ken Burns' documentary, the UUA and UUSC have made efforts to promote and publicize acts by individuals and congregations to promote justice and goodwill in our communities. These are published on the internet, and here's just a few of the examples. On March 22, 2016, Reverend Nori Roast and members of All Souls UU Church in Colorado Springs joined with 120 of their fellow residents at City Hall to rally in support of Syrian refugees. The action was organized in response to an anti-refugee resolution proposed by the city councilman Andres Pico. The Bay Area UU Church outside of Houston, Texas gathered on December 4th, 2015 to proclaim its solidarity with their next-door neighbors at the Clear Lake Islamic Center. In the face of mounting Islamophobia from public officials, including from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who that same day was trying to sue the International Rescue Committee and the federal government in order to discriminate against Syrian families in the refugee program, thankfully was unsuccessful, members and allies of the Bay Area Church gathered on the front drive leading up to the Islamic Center carrying signs of goodwill, welcome, and friendship for their Muslim neighbors. An anti-refugee group held a press conference at the Rhode Island State House on February 23, 2016 to spread toxic misinformation about Syrian and Muslim people. Bell Street Chapel, a UU church in Providence, Rhode Island, and its allies rallied to proclaim an alternative message, that refugees were welcome in Rhode Island, that Islamophobic bigotry was not. Last December, some of our fellow UUs near Kansas City were fed up with the vile rhetoric about Islam that they were hearing from U.S. politicians and knew that their faith had a different message to share. After calling up an Islamic center in their area and learning that they would welcome a show of solidarities, members of the Shawnee Mission UU Church, or Smooch as they're happy to be known, arrived at the center to stand alongside their Muslim neighbors and proclaim a message of welcome and peace. This simple act of interfaith goodwill attracted more than 100 participants, including members of the Islamic Center of Kansas, local Christian churches, and others, and garnered the attention of local media. These are just a few examples of actions taken by congregations and others to promote the cause of justice, compassion, and love across racial, ethnic, and religious lines. Now, while I've tried to identify situations where individuals or small groups have acted on their values, we must remember that we do not live in isolation. Waitsel and Martha Sharp could not have acted without the backing of the American Unitarian Association or the various resistance groups in Europe. The Unitarian Service Committee, later the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, shows how the actions of individuals can be amplified when we act in community. As we think of the Sharps' courageous response to the Holocaust, we may want to ask ourselves how we as individuals should respond to the crises of our time. But we need more than individual acts of charity and justice-making. How can we as a spiritual community come together to amplify our individual voices and have an impact on the world? Obviously, the program next Sunday on Black Lives Matter is certainly one way that we can do that and make our voice heard here in the Fond du Lac area. This year, our common theme for worship at Open Circle will be the interdependent web of which we are a part. Now, a single thread in a spider's web is a fragile thing. Yet, when woven into a web, its strength is magnified. When we act alone, we can do something. But when we act together we have power beyond our imagination. We would do well to remember this as we approach the seemingly intractable problems of our times. But that being said, we would do well to be reminded again of these words from Edward Everett Hale. I am the only one, but I am still one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. Blessed be.